you know what? I've just remembered that I have to record. You're supposed to help me remember that. I think I'll blame all of you. I'm sorry. All right, let me ask you this, because I'm not really sure. Yeah, I'm looking at this. You talked a lot about an emphasis on structures. You kept appropriately talking about institutions, government institutions, non-government interest groups, political parties, whatever. In other words, formal institutions in and out of government that have something to do with rendering political outcomes. Okay, you did mention that. What's the functionalism part of it?
Mostly how those make the system run, how they work with the people within the system. And, you can't, a political party can only do so much if it doesn't have people in it and those people to vote, and then for that voting to make laws and moving through the institutions and through.
Right. For example, if we wanted to compare using structural functionalism, and we wanted to compare the United States and Russia, looking at it in terms of structures, obviously, both countries have a president and both countries have a legislature and everything else. Where would functionalism come into a comparison between the United States and Russia?
Do they work?
Do they work, or how do they work?
How do they work?
Yeah, it's more how do they work. In other words, the assumption here is that, yeah, you might have an executive, like, Britain, for example, has a prime minister, but it's not a separate executive branch and it functions differently. The notion of government in Britain, for example, is different from the United States in the sense that the expectation in Britain is that if you control parliament, you make law. You are the government. You control all the ministries and you decide what the country's going to do going forward. We don't have that in the United States. So the idea is, part of the notion of comparison is comparing just the structures, as you say, the institutions. But what structural functionalism is, and you were kind of getting at this, but I want to make sure that we understand this as a point of emphasis. It's not enough to compare the structures. As you were kind of at least implying, you've got to look at the way they function in each system if you want to make a meaningful comparison. And this is why Tony, the author, is a little frustrated with the inability of structural functionalism as a model to integrate civil society, to talk about really what people actually do. Because, and again, you were suggesting this, but to clarify it, the model sort of assumes a system that will run of itself. The classic model is input, conversion, output, feedback. Okay, that it's like this thermostat that's self-correcting and all that. And the critique of that is exactly what you said. Where's civil society? Where are all the people? Where are the individual choices? I mean, the assumption is that these are, we're looking for the degree to which a system is democratic or involves people. Well, where are the people? So that's when he's talking about a lack of civil society. One of the things he's talking about is, sort of where are the people within that society and the things that they do. Most of you in the United States, for example, none of you really is an active member of a political party. Whereas in some European systems, you actually join a political party. You sort of sign up, I'm a social democrat, or I'm a green, or I'm a Christian Democrat. And sometimes when you vote, you don't vote for individual candidates, you vote for the party. And the party decides who from your district or jurisdiction is going to represent in parliament. Or there might be proportional representation, okay? In other words, they're much more institutionally driven. Whereas in the United States, every time you have an election, you have, 250 or so million Americans who go out and cast individual votes. And they may be informed or guided by the institution of a party, but they're still making essentially individual decisions. And a significant portion of the American electorate doesn't really feel itself to be connected to any political party. So that's a perceived weakness of structural functionalism, is it's overly concerned with formal institutions, and it's less able to capture the kind of activism and participation that's better captured by looking at what people do in society. Okay, it's a little bit, it's going to seem kind of vague for a while after we've dealt with that, and particularly after we've talked about institutionalism and some of these other things and talked about civic culture. It should make more sense. But for example, let me see if I've got the page number here. I'm sorry. Oh, the pages aren't numbered, are they? It's the second page of this. And the author says, civil society refers to the wealth of institutions, associations, and citizen groups that operate outside and independent of either government or business. They're institutions that may be formed and may arise spontaneously within society. Okay. I mean, if you think about the involvement of religion in politics and things like that, that often happens kind of spontaneously. It doesn't mean that there's not a leadership that guides that, but it's not, religion is not a part of government in this country. But we know that religion is very important to functions of the government. That varies from system to system. So one way that structural functionalism could help us, but doesn't, for example, would be, what's the role of the church in each of these political systems? Because the church isn't normally thought of as a political institution anymore. I mean, it might have been 300, 400, 500 years ago, but it's not now. So when he says, when he talks about civil society and leaving out very important forces that move within political society, that's what he's talking about. Does that make sense? I mean, generally, Tony, you capture the essence of it. But, and you also explained why we would want to try, why they thought, the authors thought, structural functionalism might be a way to compare systems, because it does more than just compare institutions. It actually looks at the way they function. And that's not without value. Okay. Is there anything else that anybody, either in terms of uncertainties where you looked at it and it still doesn't make sense? Yeah, Monica?
Yeah, just to clarify, when you say that the church isn't a political institution, you mean for the United States, right?
Yes.
Because there are countries that don't have separation of church and state, and in that case, they would be considered a political institution.
They could be. Yeah, they could. Okay. They could be. Many of those, there aren't many of those societies left, but of those that are left, some of them conceive of politics differently too. They don't have the same secular notion of politics that, for example, Western Europe and the United States and Canada and places like that have. I mean, even Britain, you think about that, Britain has an established church, but it's generally not, it has cultural and social power, as churches will have, but it's not considered to be very politically relevant. Britain arguably has a more secular political system than the United States, even though it has an official religion, the Anglican Church. Okay, but you're right. I mean, there are clearly some societies with very diffuse systems, some aspirational societies, like the notion with Islamic State of a pan-Islamic, caliphate or something, that would be specifically theocratic. You have Iran, for example, that's a quasi-theocracy. I mean, it's like a theocratic republic, okay, where clearly the church is central to politics in a place like Iran and other countries as well. That's relatively unusual in the 21st century. But it also, if you're looking at it in terms of civil society, the role of religion, you're more able to capture that than if you're just looking at formal institutions. Because as we said, most modern systems don't integrate the church explicitly and discreetly into politics as a permanent institution. But you're right, some countries still do. And again, there's nothing that's saying that 10, 20, 50 years from now, more countries might. A lot of things can change. So the concern is, does structural functionalism acting alone capture all that for us? The last thing that Tony mentioned is kind of not so much the role of money as the role of wealth. Because we know, this is where, for example, Marxism and post-Marxism come in, and certain kinds of post-structuralism, where they, the idea is, wait a minute, you have these political institutions and everything, but everybody knows that in the final analysis, the wealthy push the buttons and the rest of us respond. Structural functionalism does not allow for that. So Tony, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no explicit place in structural functionalism for radical class analysis or control of the means of production and things like that. It's really economically barren, which I think is what you were saying. I wanted to make sure I'm understanding you. You're absolutely right. And that's a critique that you developed that isn't developed very sharply in the article. So that's actually quite useful. It's been criticized a lot for not allowing for economic power in terms of the capacity of economic power to yield political outcomes. And I think, Tony, isn't that, I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not just campaign contributions, it's concentrations of wealth in powerful individuals and institutions that can pull a system, to and fro, right? Yeah, I think that's a really spot on analysis. And again, it's one that's underdeveloped in the article itself. So I'm glad that you took that extra step to kind of clarify that for us. That's actually quite useful. Okay, let's see. Now, civic culture. This is a little bit weird because notice it's chapter 13. This is clearly a part of a much larger work. And yet there are a few things conceptually, many of them related to structural functionalism, that we can look at that sort of build out on structural functionalism. Ullman and Powell, the principal authors of the civic culture model, they are essentially structural functionalists. So what they're talking about is a specific application of that. So now I can go to Karen and Nanika. Did you have a way that you wanted to pursue that?
We didn't get together to go over how to do it.
Wasn't required.
Okay, so I think this, like you said, this is part of a book. It discusses looking at democratic societies in different nations. It uses the US and the UK as the closest to be compared in the same boat, and then looks at Mexico, Germany, and Italy.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you never again to use the expression "in the same boat."
Sorry, I'll sink that boat.
Remember what I said on the first day about not using vernacular, okay?
There you go.
And you guys you catch me when I do it, except that when I do it, it's generally colorful and it involves an obscenity.
So this article basically talks about what does it take to create and maintain a stable and effective democracy? What is the role of the citizen in creating and contributing to a stable democratic society? And what they term the elite or decision makers role in that same society? Successful / stable democracy means that citizens need to be involved in politics. They have to be informed. They have to be influential, or what I like is the myth of democracy, feel that they can be influential, which is sort of the lie that we might operate under. On the flip side of that, the elite or the decision makers have to feel that they're allowed to operate somewhat autonomously, but that there's the threat that if they do something to piss off the citizenry, that we will react or protest or not contribute to their, political coffers or whatever. So,
excuse me, but notice that I did not object to piss off.
Okay, sorry.
Perfectly appropriate. Also, leave your partner something to do.
Yeah, and then so one of the things that I think the reason for this article, or one of the main points of it, is, can you just take a cut and paste stable democracy formula and put it into any new nation that is just trying to evolve with a democratic government? And the point they make is the answer is kind of no, because one thing that can't be cut and pasted is civic culture or social norms, and those take time to sort of kind of percolate through the DNA or percolate through culture and come into being.
Okay, Karen,
I'm leaving a lot out.
You got to leave Nanika something to do.
Yeah, there's a ton left out.
There is. No, but that's fine. All right.
Yeah.
Can we start there with this idea of what a civic culture is? And in other words, remember they had a model of what they thought it was. Then they actually did some surveys and found out what it really looked like. And it seems to me that they found out that it was a little different than they thought it would be. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So they use the rationality activist model for a successful democracy that basically says that to be a good citizen, Karen touched on this, is to be active and informed with politics, whereas civic culture contains contradictory political attitudes that I think, but from my understanding says that it's interchangeable to contemporary politics now in our democratic systems, because we're always going to have people that agree and disagree on certain issues, which is pretty healthy, actually, which from my understanding seems to be pretty healthy, because for leadership there needs to be a balance between consensus and cleavage, it says, with the citizens, as well as power and responsiveness. Because the idea of over-intensity in politics can encourage instability, whereas if there isn't any interest at all, then it fails for any change or any needs and issues that need to be addressed by the citizens. The chapter says that the US and the United Kingdom actually do this pretty well, whereas in Germany, Italy, and Mexico, they're a little bit more unbalanced in these areas. Germany actually has a lack of commitment to the political system that has, Germany says that there is a lack of, balance between the elite and then the non-elite. I think that the elite are more concerned with international relations, and they don't really adhere to any of the issues that are addressed by the citizens. Whereas Mexico experiences a lack of experience with political input just because of either the lack of interest or the lack of education, which is another reason why people may not be involved in politics as much as they should, which would classify them as not a good citizen. For Italy, it lacks the passive output of satisfaction of the Germans and the aspirational input satisfaction of Mexico. Mexico actually has one event, or a unifying event, the Mexican Revolution. So that's basically my understanding of this article and what civic culture is but what it means to be a good citizen, but the understanding that not everybody is going to be like that. There's people that are super involved in politics, that are very informed of it, but also people that don't care or just are not educated enough to be a part of it.
Yeah, I think, that's the essence of the model, and it's important in a variety of ways. One of the things early on in the article that's talked about is the distinction they found between what people perceive as their obligations to participate and how much they actually do participate. And this is where they found out that, for example, in what they perceived as relatively well-functioning, high-functioning, vibrant democratic cultures like the United States and Britain, they found a surprisingly low level of that rational activist that Nanako talked about. In other words, the idea of a rational activist is that, first of all, yes, you are and aspire to be active in politics on a more or less regular basis. You see it as sort of part of your role as part of society. And the rationality of it is that you are knowledgeable and informed in the decisions that you make. And that what they found was that, well, this is common with Americans. Karen just pointed out in the chat, very high percentages of people feel like, yes, it's a good thing to participate. Remarkably few are actively involved. And survey data going all the way back to the 50s and continuing through today repeatedly demonstrate this, that, for example, we talk about, and a lot of countries right now are talking about the rise of an extreme political right and polarization and all this kind of stuff, as though entire societies are actually being ripped apart by excessive activism. In fact, that's not true. The old civic culture assumption that relatively small numbers within society will be the rational activists, it still holds true. It's just that today, what they would call rational activists are much louder, much more active in what they do, and more polarized themselves. That is, the strong partisans or the strong ideologues are more polarized and antagonistic than we've seen in a long time. Whereas the mainstreams of most modern societies are what they always were. They're fairly stable, they're fairly moderate, and as both of you pointed out, they're fairly inactive. They might or may not, maybe around election time, people tend to pay more attention to the system. But beyond that, they tend to just kind of accept what comes along, up to the point where they really get pissed off. Monica?
Does civic culture also apply to countries that are non-democratic?
Well, here's one of the problems. Yeah, I mean, let's go ahead and critique it a little bit. The critique was implied in the analysis that we just had, but let's look at that. What are the biases of that? One of the biases, Karen pointed out, is an expectation of or emphasis on stability. The idea that, stability, first of all, what does a stable system look like? And what's the difference between a stable system and a stagnant system? Or between a stable system and a repressive system? Repression can yield a kind of apparent stability too. Okay. Another one of the assumptions is what Monica is suggesting, which was a kind of assumption that, well, democracy is the ultimate aim here. Okay. Well, it isn't. In many parts of the world, people do not aspire to democracy. They do, in fact, aspire to stability, and they see democracy as chaotic. Okay. And so it did assume democracy. I mean, the civic culture model really does assume at least aspirational democracy, that people want democracy, that systems disproportionately are populated by people who want to participate and who want democracy. Is that what you're asking? Yeah, so it is often looked at as a kind of conceptual bias of the model, that it really doesn't account for any number of systems, particularly in post-Soviet Eastern Europe. There are strong strains within every one of those cultures that are fundamentally anti-democratic. They don't want democracy. They think that democracy is corrupt. They think that, tolerance and liberalism and all that kind of stuff is corrupt and chaotic and is not to be aspired to. The civic culture model would not quite know where to fit those societies or how to analyze them. It would probably look at them in pretty uniformly negative terms, if that's what you're asking. Yeah, if it could even make sense of them. So that is one of the built-in sort of engineering flaws of structural functionalism as a kind of elaboration of structural functionalism, but also of the civic culture as an elaboration of structural functionalism. Is when you start bringing human beings and their biases and their perceptions, and the fact that, as has been pointed out, most of us really don't want to be involved in politics most of the time. We look at it as a nuisance, or whatever. This model doesn't always work very well. Yeah. Another one is this notion of socialization. Okay, when Tony talked about this a little bit in her discussion of structural functionalism, but I don't think you used the term socialization. But when you were right though, when you were talking about like the understanding of how do kids get educated. Structural functionalism in general, and the civic culture in particular, really focus on political socialization. One of the important mechanisms of continuity in all political systems, but particularly in democratic systems, is the passing on of the values of democracy, right? And Karen, you hinted at that a little bit. Well, I don't mean hinted like you missed it, but you had a lot you covered in a kind of a big flyover, but clearly that notion of socialization is very important. That it's part of what gives the system its responsiveness and its vibrancy, is that generally you have people who, while they may, as Nanako suggested, people are going to disagree, and sometimes they're going to disagree pretty emphatically. It's not a real problem, and it doesn't trigger widespread instability, according to this model, as long as what they do agree upon are the general rules of the game, right? That, that there's going to be relatively civil discourse, that elections matter and elections have consequences, and whether you like the outcome or not, you respect the outcome of it and you accept the outcome as legitimate and all that. Now, those things are under assault in the United States. By the way, they are under direct assault. This is not like an accident, and it's not Donald Trump, right? This is an anti-democratic movement within the United States. And it's the same as anti-democratic movements all throughout Europe and much of the rest of the world. One of the strongest forces on the rise right now might indeed be anti-democracy. Okay. The civic culture model isn't really designed, and I think this is what, Monica, if I'm not reading into what you're saying, I think this is what you might have had in mind. I mean, how would the civic culture model explain what we're seeing with the rise of right-wing politics and the fragmentation of activists and things like that? It's not that it couldn't do it. may though not be nearly as effective as that model might have been 50, 60 years ago, okay? So when you think about these things, again, I'm not saying it's good or bad, or I disagree or I agree. What we're looking at is, well, what are the implications of this model if we try to apply it to comparing systems? Okay, either generally structural functionalism, as Tony was talking about, or the specific notion of that with the civic culture that we're talking about now. Is it liable to work? What will it tell us that we need to know, and what might it not tell us that we still need to know? Okay, any questions so far? This is going fine. If you're wondering how these presentations should go, kind of like this. Okay, now notice neither one of those presentations was particularly long, but we covered a lot of material, so it can be done. Both of the presentations were very concise, they were well organized, but it wasn't just a summary of the article. It was, okay, let me just get the bullet points of what you need to understand here. And I thought, again, so far so good. I think we've done a very, very good job. What about, hold on just a second. I got to open this up and get all my notes available here. What about rational choice?
Yeah. Rational choice theory is a theory that says that all action is fundamentally rational in character, and people calculate the likelihood of costs and benefits to make of any action to make any decision. This is based on economic theory. So it's saying like everyone in economics uses money as their general enforcer to do things. And in this,
Can we stop right there?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure that that's what they meant.
okay,
It's not so much money, it's the market. It's the environment. Money's just a medium of exchange. Okay.
Yeah.
In other words, money doesn't make the decision. The idea is we make decisions because of the constraints imposed on us by the market.
Yeah.
Okay. And rational choice is supposed to have the same assumption. Yeah, sorry. Just to clarify.
yes. And then for rational choice theory, like the parallel to that would be approval. So that's kind of what we exchange in exchange theory is like in all social interactions, we exchange approval, and that the basic assumption is that complex society phenomenon can be explained in terms of elementary individual actions that they are composed of.
Can you say that again slowly? Because that's the absolute key to unlocking rational choice.
It's that complex social phenomenon can be explained in terms of elementary individual actions that they are composed of.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
This comes from behavioralism, so that we're conditioned, like conditioning. I don't know if anyone knows Skinner's behavioralism. So, and then when we apply that to interactions, it's mutual reinforcement. So in social interactions, each person's behavior toward the other person either rewards or punishes the other. And that's where we get the social exchange from. The problems that arise from this theory is that it doesn't explain collective action, social norms, or social structure. If everyone was doing something based on their own, for their own benefit, why would someone join a social group such as like unions? Because they could still get the benefits from unions without joining them. Say if you were like a steel worker, you didn't have to join the union to still reap the benefits that the union was doing to raise wages and stuff. Because that wouldn't, you would still reap the benefit, but the cost wouldn't be worth it to advocate and do all that stuff. Social norms kind of plays the same role. Why would you go along with social norms if the cost isn't worth the benefit, and go along with other people's ideas of what benefits them? And then for the social structure, it's for individualism rather than rational choice theory. It creates difficulties for theories that are considered. So you wouldn't support other people's efforts to go after what they want. Every choice you would make would be a cost and benefit for yourself. So you wouldn't join social movements if they didn't directly benefit you.
Right. Okay, I mean, you've got most of the moving parts. Let me just sharpen a few of the things that you mentioned. I would say that rather than saying that this is behavioralism, because I mean, I'm trained as a behavioralist, but I'm not a Skinnerian, okay? It's a kind of behavioralism that they're looking at, and the behavioralism they're looking at is what's referred to, and I think it's on the 3rd page. I don't know if these are numbered. It's the idea of methodological individualism, which is a kind of behavioralism. So you're not wrong. I just wanted to make sure that if you saw that phrase methodological individualism, that's the kind of behavioralism they're talking about. Because you already explained it. The idea is that we can take any complex phenomenon within a society, and ultimately, looking at it properly, we will understand it as the outcome of individual rational choices. Okay, also the idea that everyone has preferences. Rationality assumes preferences, and that people act in order to realize those preferences. And as you said, in social exchange, the preference is some measure of approval. And it's not just because we want to be popular at parties, okay? And you weren't saying that, I know, but it's like because we're social animals, and not to obtain approval is to risk exclusion. And social animals being excluded, it's about the worst thing you can do to an organically social animal is exclude them. So there's a real imperative that's according to this theory for people to actualize their rational benefit and seek maximum approval as they define it. What makes me feel like I'm being approved of? In other words, is it that people are afraid of me because I'm so badass, or is it people laugh when I want them to because I'm funny, or is it that people like me because I'm helpful, or whatever the kind of approval is, and you were suggesting this, you act rationally in order to maximize that. So it isn't always, and this is why it's important that you said that, it's not always that we're looking for a material gain. That's a common misconception of people when they try to understand rational choice, is the assumption that, and it's why I kind of cautioned you about using money, okay? Because, in other words, it's not always rational to do things for money, according to this theory, but as you suggested, it's always rational to do things that will maximize your approval, because that's maximizing your social function. You are more relevant and important to a society the more you are approved of. Okay, and that was good. I'm glad you emphasized that, because that's really important. What about the idea, though, that another thing you said, that there's a disincentive, according to the critique, to act collectively. Okay, because the idea is, again, following on methodological individualism, why would you sacrifice or incur any costs for something that wouldn't benefit you discreetly, right? And other people might benefit from what you do, even though you're the one, by being the one who organized the union and risk getting your head broken open or whatever, you're the one who took on the costs. The people who are not union, who are hired by that company, are achieving the benefits. Well, what that leaves out, and this is covered in a book from the 1960s called The Logic of Collective Action, is that rationality does not presuppose altruism. And what altruism is what you were describing, that you will act even to the extent of sacrificing for the good of others. One of the things about altruism, first of all, is altruism can yield a lot of social approval. If people see that you're making, think about how we respond to first responders, how we think about first responders. We're always throwing out the word hero. And one of the few places where that really tends to fit is like people who fight fires and people who protect us from bad people. There is something heroic in that, because they're taking supreme risks. And you know what they're not doing it for? The money, because neither firefighters nor police officers are well paid, given the risks that they take. There is a strain of altruism in that. So the question is, are they really thinking rationally? Okay.
Yeah, so they cover this very briefly in the article, that even rationalists can say that that is still making a rational choice, because you're outweighing the cost to the benefit, and the benefit there would be exactly as you say, that any action that you're doing for somebody else to help somebody else
Mhm.
ultimately comes from, oh, I want that approval, and
Yep.
it makes me feel good to help somebody else. Not,
Exactly.
I want to help them because they need help. It's, I want to help them because it makes me feel good to help them. Like when you give money to
Right.
somebody
To a
homeless.
charity. That's an example that's often used because that actually costs you money and you do it anonymously, but you still feel good,
Mhm.
right? I mean, when I go to Safeway and there's usually a thing on there that says, hey, do you want to give like $1, $3, or $5 to students or to make sure kids eat or whatever? Yeah, I do that. I do it without thinking. I do it because I can afford it. It's only a little bit of money. I do it because I know for a fact that a lot of those programs actually do good. And I do it, yes, because it makes me sleep a little better at night. Okay, so I'm reluctant to say it's selfish. Something that benefits you isn't intrinsically selfish if in benefiting you, you know that it benefits others. But it definitely is rational. And that's the main thing we're looking at. So yeah, you clarified that really well. And that helps a lot. That is sometimes an unfair criticism then of rational choice, that it doesn't account for altruism. As you just explained, Gabrielle, yeah, of course it does. Of course it does. Particularly when you apply psychology, it actually accounts for it really well. Okay. Now, here's the thing that's a little more puzzling to some people. What does rational choice have to do with comparing political systems?
Oh, it has a lot to do with it, because if you're applying rational choice to like the US model, and how we elect representatives, we do that. It would explain that we do that all based on our own intentions. And then also once they are elected, they make all the choices because they don't have to do exactly what all their constituents want.
That's
And
right.
they make that choice, and they can easily, and we see this often, make choices that benefit them. And that's throughout. And so when comparing political systems and how we elect representatives or hire representatives, if you compare like a democracy to a dictatorship, we have one person who is making decisions based on their personal interests and whatever their motivation is, whether it's approval or control or power, whatever, compared to a democracy where you can, it's spread out more, where you think, oh, well, we have way more representatives, way more people making decisions, but they're all still at the root of it making decisions based on their own interests.
Right. I'm going to go even farther than that, though. It also explains why in some societies, authoritarian rule is more readily accepted. Okay. And even within the United States, there has always been a stratum of American society that is intrinsically and traditionally authoritarian, and it's perfectly rational. Because for many people, it's perfectly rational to accept authority, to understand it's important that the richest or the wisest, or let's be honest, the whitest actually are the ones making our choices for us. And I accept that because it fits into all of my assumptions about how the world is supposed to work. And it is to my benefit to go along with that. It also explains things like non-voting and non-participation. It's called rational abstention. Are there rational reasons for people not to vote or not to follow politics? Yes. If you have what's called a low level of political efficacy, if you believe, and many Americans do, for example, many people around the world do, if you believe either that you don't have any business being involved in politics or that leadership is never going to listen to you, then it's perfectly rational to forego the costs in time and frustration and energy of remaining current with politics and being an informed voter. It's perfectly rational to abstain from that. Okay, that's still rational choice. But as you suggested, that can vary across political systems. Is it rational right now for the people of Russia or Belarus to go along with a Lukashenko or a Putin or whoever, a thug essentially in power? For a lot of people, yeah. You know why? Because you know what the rationality is? They put people in prison, they torture people, they kill people. I mean, we have to think that way. We have to be aware that there are people whose political lives are constrained by real existential concerns. The place that's considered to be the most dangerous for professional journalists right now is not sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia. It's Belarus. Okay. And that is a supposedly developed country. So you're right. We can use rational choice at that level where structural functionalism kind of lets us down, as was suggested earlier, at that level of where are all the people and the individual's choices they make and the decisions they make. Rational choice can help fill in those gaps for us conceptually and analytically that structural functionalism was never intended to calibrate for, to measure. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, please tell me that it doesn't, if there's a better way that I can explain that. In other words, if you were to come up with a comprehensive model of comparison, you might want to think about incorporating the institutional structures and some of the assumptions of structural functionalism or the civic culture, but you might also want to incorporate at that level of the individual, especially if you're using survey data, as they were in the civic culture, you might want to bring in a little bit of that rational choice model that Gabrielle just talked about, because the idea here is they both have utility, but they're designed to explain different things to us, but they both have comparative utility. Okay. So that's why they're included in the same unit. Anything else about rational choice? And yes, you can apply rational choice to non-democratic societies, to absolutist societies. You could have applied it to the Soviet Union, both in terms of the leadership, but also in terms of the willingness of the population to go along with leadership, whether they liked it or not. You got to, you have, what's my first preference? That neither I nor my family will be imprisoned, tortured or killed. That's a pretty compelling rationale to go along with the worst kind of system, at least until such time as you see a window of opportunity to do something about it. Okay. Anything else? Okay, that was good. Yeah, see, again, these are not very long presentations, but there's a lot in them. All right, so finally, new institutionalism. This is it's a long article, got a lot of moving parts. The challenge here is, can you boil it down to its essence?
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brandon Rainville. My partner for this project was Monica Benton. And how we organize new institutionalism is I'm going to introduce to you institutionalism, what you need to know about it, the main points of what's new. And then from there, we'll go into the 3 types of new institutionalism. And from there, I will begin with what is institutionalism. So according to what we found, institutionalism in social sciences is an approach that emphasizes the role of institutions themselves. And according to the article that we read, it's the theory of how individuals influence institutions and vice versa. So 2 fundamental issues to any institutional analysis this is a quote from the article, how to construe the relationship between institutions and behavior, and how to explain the process whereby institutions originate or change. So what's new about it? What's new with these new institutionalisms? So there's 3 of them. The new theories and understandings of how institutions interact with individuals and why institutions are created and continue to exist. And again, so the 3 new institutionals that you read and we'll go over today are historical institutionalism, rational choice institutionalism, and sociological institutionalism. The new types of institutions have arisen, and therefore scholars and intellectuals can look over, we can look into them further and every institution, and then begin to theorize and make sense of the ever-changing landscape of ideas and possibilities that humans have created. And I would also just add that for the new institutions that have arisen, it allows people like us in everyday life, not only in our college class, but in our societies in and around, we can begin discussing these new theories and bring them to light so we can forever change our ideas and institutions moving forward. And with that, I will turn it over to Monica.
Thank you. So when reading these, there's the 3 different sections of the different institutionalisms. And we noticed that it was sort of organized in the explanations of each type of institutionalism was kind of organized into 3 different questions. What drove the creation of this theory of institutionalism? What drives the actions of the individual, and how do institutions influence this? And that question has a lot to do with the previous articles as well. And then why do institutions persist over time? So historical institutionalism, to me, this one was the one with the most layers. It originated because historical institutionalists wanted to locate institutions in a causal chain that sorry, I'm reading a quote right now. So they aim to determine what effect institutions have on outcomes while considering all other factors as well. So they did this because structural functionalism and other similar theories had sort of shortcomings, as we were discussing earlier, that it didn't necessarily discuss all aspects of institutions and institutional effects on the individual and vice versa. And so they aimed to sort of fill in those gaps. And in doing so, they decided on having 2 different approaches. So they coined the calculus approach and the cultural approach in terms of how individuals act and perceive the world. So the calculus approach assumes that individuals seek to maximize their attainment of goals, and they behave strategically. And institutions affect individual action by altering the expectations an actor has about the actions. And the cultural approach is kind of the flip side of that. It sees individuals as satisficers. And so individuals act based on what feels right given their experience, and institutions persist because they influence these feelings and thought patterns. And the historical institutionalism model says that institutions persist over time in 2 different ways based on these 2 different approaches. So according to the calculus approach, they persist because deviation by the individual will make the individual worse off than will adherence. So institutions provide the individual gain or at least a lack of harm to the individual. And the cultural approach says that tradition is important to individuals, more so than whether that tradition still serves them. So if with the cultural approach, institutions are so conventional or taken for granted that they can escape direct scrutiny, and cannot readily be transformed by the actions of one individual. And rational choice institutionalism is similar to rational choice that we were discussing before, but it sort of goes into more depth. And it was inspired by an observation of a paradox. And they were saying that the conventional rational choice predictions say that it should be difficult for the United States Congress to secure stable majorities given the rational choice model. And so to solve this paradox, they argue that the rules and stability that these institutions provide, they provide agenda control, and they limit the range and sequence of the options facing congressional votes. And so that rational choice is limited to a more limited amount of choices for them. So they can't, the individual actor, the individuals, people like us who are trying to participate in politics don't have as many options as they would if Congress or any other institutions were a bit more broad and didn't kind of spoon feed these different choices. And in terms of what drives the actions of the individual, again, this is based off the rational choice model. So they say that individuals have a fixed set of preferences or tastes, and that's what dictates their decisions. And institutions persist over time because, according to the rational choice model, because institutions provide more benefits to the relevant actors than alternate institutional forms. And so specific institutions persist because they're more useful to individuals than other institutions, and also better than a lack of institutions. So that's the first 2, and I'll hand it back to Brandon for sociological institutionalism.
So to conclude, the 3rd and final new institutionalism is sociological institutionalism. And when we ask ourselves what drove the creation of this institution, is that it's created in order for sociologists to challenge the distinction traditionally between those parts of the social world said to reflect a formal means-ends rationality of the sort associated with modern forms of organization and bureaucracy, and those parts of the social world said to display a diverse set of practices associated with culture. So comparing and contrasting our like means ends based society institutions, and then actually applying that with culture itself and how it applies, and how over time we adapt and we change our way of thinking, and therefore the institution itself ends up changing. So what drives the actions of the individual, and how do institutions influence this? So for sociological institutionalism, the individual takes a distinctive approach to the problem of explaining how institutional practices originate and change. Institutions influence behavior, not simply by specifying what one should do, but also by specifying what one can imagine oneself doing, given a particular context. It's not just formal rules, procedures, and norms, but more so templates that provide the frames of meaning guiding human action. In other words, breaking down conceptual divide between institutions and culture. So again, in the article, it brings up, there's a quote that says, the approach tends to redefine culture itself as institutions. And again, for sociological, it makes sense, and I'll get into it in my last part, just to kind of summarize the sociological institutionalism. But essentially, I would say that sociological institutions, the institutions themselves have persisted over time. They've always been there. But in the 70s, when the sociological institutionalism was created or thought of to be started, it's more so rationalizing and doing a compare and contrast and understanding why institutions change over time, and specifically culture itself being the drive of that. So why does sociological institutionalism persist over time? It persists over time because it evolves to fit the changing needs of the actors and individuals. The actors have an active relationship with the institution itself and must update or redesign the institution over time in order to help solidify public opinion and trust in the institution. If this relationship failed, a new institution would simply be created to fit the needs of society. Again, this rarely happens in context of an institution itself. I think that this would be a rare case, but it's always there because a new institution to fit the society would simply just be created. And then to finish up for sociological, in theory, they've always existed and evolved over time. Debates among society members, they create essentially a hierarchy of needs in their respective societies and determine which values are needed most. The official study of this by sociologists originated in the 70s, as I stated before. As mentioned, in what drove the creation of the theory of this theory of institutionalism, the difference of means and results versus the cultural needs is what's actually being studied here in sociological institution.
I've assigned this article in this class for, I think, the last 5 years. And I think that's, without question, the most concise and well-crafted presentation of that article I've ever heard. That was out of the, because that, you see how dense that is. And yet you did, between the two of you, and if it sounds like I'm being condescending, I'm not. I'm just really, I was really digging that. And I was making notes, and then you'd say it and I'd go, oh, I don't have to worry about that. But you can see how you can take complexity like this, and it's cumbersome, but you can break it down to its essential structure. Okay, let me, before I take any questions that might remain there, let me talk about a few things that actually unify the different institutionalisms, all of which were implied in this presentation. The first one is this notion of structuralism. Okay, that every one of these is a structuralist theory. Okay, in other words, the assumption of structuralism is that all social decision making is explicable. That is, we can make sense of it because it's structured, and it's structured within the context of an environment of institutions, as well as within the constraints of any individual institution. So structuralism is the first component. In other words, it's not pure free-ranging rational choice, where it's just atomized individuals floating around like radical free electrons and making these autonomous choices. That in fact, our lives are structured by institutions. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily captives of those structures. It means those structures guide us, they inform us, and they guide us in our decision-making. So that first component is structuralism as it applies here. Every one of the theories you talked about is a structuralist theory, okay? The second one is rationality, okay? And it follows directly from the assumptions of structuralism. There is a rationality that's inherent in every one of those institutional models, okay? And it is the idea that rationality informs individual adherence to structures. There's a rational reason why we vote the way we do, or why we drive on the right-hand side of the road. These are all structures. They structure our decision-making, and it's rational for us to do that for the reasons we've already pointed out in all of our other discussions of rational choice, okay? So, you know, it's rational to do that, okay? That in fact, there's a real benefit in having these structures in our lives, for all that they may from time to time impinge upon our sovereignty. Any governing system does that. Government by definition impinges upon individual sovereignty, okay? So the idea is there a rational way to navigate those impingements on sovereignty? All of these institutionalisms suggest, of course there is, because we're social animals, and social animals require structure. Institutions are structures, okay? So structuralism and rationality. The third one that's not maybe quite as clear all the time and was teased out really accurately in both parts of this presentation is that culture matters, properly understood, because culture simultaneously functions in two ways. Culture is an environment within which institutions function. And it's an environment structured by institutions, okay? But also there is the ethos within any specific institution that can constrain decision-making. So that, you know, when you look at the difference in decision-making, right, between a for-profit corporation and a public university, theoretically is going to operate differently, right? They both have executive functions. They both have kind of systems management functions. They have fiscal functions and everything else. But the decisions are made and informed by different imperatives in different institutions. That's the structure of rationality within those institutions. You can say the same thing about political institutions. You look at the difference between, say, being within the leadership as a Democrat in the House as opposed to being a Republican in the Senate or something like that, all right? There are certain structural imperatives by which you are bound in your decision-making. You're limited. There's only so much you can do as an individual representative. Depending on the disposition of seats within legislature, there's only so much that your party can do, all right? And you have to, in terms of making decisions, you have to decide of the possible options for action that Democrats in the House or Republicans in the Senate can take, which are the ones that are most likely to yield the most benefit, as we view benefit, okay? But all of those choices are constrained by the structures of those institutions. Does that make sense? Because if it doesn't, tell me. Because to the extent that that makes sense, it means we can do a lot of work on, for example, comparative legislative behavior. How does the British Parliament behave differently from the American, House of Representatives or United States Senate? Okay, the House of Commons is often compared to the House of Representatives, the House of Lords to the Senate, but they're very different in many ways. The executive branch functionally is embedded within the legislature, and so structured differently in the British parliamentary system than it is in the American presidential system, okay? Presidents can only do so many things legally, okay? To the extent that they push to the boundaries of those institutions and those constraints, which we saw in the last 4 years of the Trump administration, for example, you see someone who says, well, no, I was elected to come in here and essentially to break things, to break the points of resistance, to show that institutions are not superior to whatever is necessary to, to make America great again or whatever. Okay, that largely failed. Institutions are incredibly durable and resilient. They structure decision-making. Every time that President Trump tried to impose an outcome, he was constrained in his actual ability to realize that outcome by both the two houses of Congress and the court system, and also resistance within the permanent executive branch, okay, the so-called deep state, okay. Those things matter. Later on, we're going to talk about state theory. Come back to this kind of thinking when we talk about theories of the state, because the idea is that, states can operate with a certain amount of autonomy. Government institutions can take actions autonomous of the people who they govern and represent. Even in republics, they can do that. They have the power to do that. We don't have direct oversight over what the House, the Senate, the courts, the president, what anybody does, okay? There's very little in the immediate sense that we can do about that, okay? That would be state sovereignty. That's part of the rationality of institutions. If you know that you've got a significant bandwidth of opportunity for choices, you're going to take advantage of that. On the other hand, if you know that the institution within which you're making decisions is really constrained in terms of the few things it's allowed to do, that's going to determine the limitations on the kinds of choices you're liable to make. Okay, so again, this idea of structuralism, rationality, and this notion of culture as the kind of rules of the game within which we conduct our affairs. Language is a rule of the game. Laws are rules of the game. Customs and tradition are all, they determine rules of the game. They all constrain decision-making, all of them. Culture matters, okay? But it's not culture just in the sense of, well, what colorful clothing do we wear? Or what food do we eat? It's culture in terms of how do we see the world and what do we value, okay? All right, does that make sense? Yeah, okay. I thought this went really well, in part because I didn't do nearly as much talking today. And that's always a good sign. And so are there, again, assuming you're either making notes or otherwise playing along at home, are there any of the points that were raised here where, given that, we're going to have another chance to review, I suppose, at some point if we need it, but are there things here where you're looking at it and saying, that really doesn't make sense to me? Or what about this, that, anything like that? Or is it just like, well, I need to let this marinate a little bit? Okay, well then what I would suggest is that I've just made the first assignment available to you on the Moodle page. So what I would suggest, you don't need to do it right now, but at some point between now and when the assignment is due, which is on Sunday the 10th at 11 p.m., take a look at the assignment. It's pretty generic and it allows you to play to your strength. If you've taken good notes on these presentations, this assignment should be, especially if you've actually read as well, this assignment should be pretty straightforward for you. But if you have any questions, or if you want to send me like a preliminary introductory paragraph or an outline or something like that, just, hey, am I on the right track here? Okay, I can accept those, let's say up until Friday. If you've got something like that that you want, you're not required to do it. Okay, now, at your discretion, okay, once I get the first written assignments, and it always takes me a couple days to grade, I am painfully slow at grading because I like to do it right. If you have any interest in this, one of the things we can do in our next class meeting is we can actually look at examples of your writing and sort of figure out, okay, without your names being associated with them or anything else, look at like take a couple of sentences or a paragraph or something, analyze it and decide, does this work? Is it effective? How could it be improved? Okay, I'm going to leave that to your discretion. We can talk about that when we meet as a class, presuming that we do, on next Monday, the 11th. Okay, so we'll take as much time in terms of reviewing the written material as we need to. The other thing is, obviously, I mentioned this before, I'll mention it again. If you complete the assignment and you really think you nailed it, and then you get your grade back and it's not what you expected, okay, the initiative needs to be yours. You get a hold of me. We can get, the best way to do this is get on Zoom, have your written material in front of you, I'll have it in front of me and we can go through and I can explain to you why I evaluated it the way I did. And then if you have sufficient interest in it, then I will, in many cases, extend the opportunity for you to rewrite it. Okay, because I want you to do two things. I want you to understand what effective writing kind of looks like and what less effective writing looks like. But I also want to have you have the opportunity to submit to your satisfaction the best work you're capable of submitting. So I look at it this way. The assignment that I get from you on the deadline is essentially a rough draft. Okay, most of you won't have the opportunity to do more than a rough draft. Okay, but if after you have a chance to think about it, you think, I could have said this better. You know how you do that after an exam? Man, I could have said this and this and this. Well, fine. Then you approach me. We'll meet on Zoom. And if you make a compelling case and you tell me what you want to clarify, then either I'll say, you know what, you've already done it to my satisfaction, and I may alter the grade right there. But more likely I'll say, okay, give me another draft and you have until such and such a day. All right. So that you have the opportunity to submit to me work that you're satisfied is the best that you can produce. Now, again, if this class isn't as important to you, or you think you've done the best you can do, you're not under any obligation. If you get a B and you expected a B and you're happy to take a B or a C or whatever, then that's fine. You can take that. But if you are, particularly if you're kind of underwhelmed by the grade that you got, you might want to talk to me. In fact, you really should, okay? Because I found that if I try to write extensive comments, they don't make sense to people. It's really hard to do that. It's so much easier to meet with you individually and talk through, why I analyzed your work the way I did. Any questions on the assignment? Okay, so as I say, let's say anytime before Friday evening, because that gives me Saturday day to respond. And the only thing I have to do on Saturday, I think, is recreate. You can, as I say, you can send me an outline or introductory paragraph or something like that. This is kind of the way I wanted to approach this assignment. Does that make sense? And then it gives me the chance to respond to you. But don't do it on Saturday or Sunday, because it's my weekend. I don't want to have to hurry to do something on the weekend. I don't mind doing it during the week. Okay. Anything else? Yes, Monica.
Are the notes due at the same time as this assignment?
Well, the notes can be used on your assignment. In terms of a, in quotes, due date, the notes are kind of a work in progress. You might go back and augment those notes at some point if you have a thought. But what I will do is I'll go in on Monday morning. Okay, because then you've had the assignment and you've had use of the notes. I will probably then, for a day or so, I may shut the notes off and I'll go through and evaluate them and decide, okay, did this person make a good faith effort to address, to that part of the assignment? Because it's actually part of your written assignment. Okay. But it's not like, there's a due date and then those notes are done forever. You can use those notes. You can go back and refer to them if you need to for some reason or anything else. But I would say by the time you turn your assignment in, you should already have completed your notes. I mean, it just makes rational sense that you would have done that. If you haven't done, I'm gonna lower the grade on your written assignment. Okay.
And the same goes for the presentations.
If you've done the presentation, you do not have to do the written assignment, but you still have to do the notes. Yeah. So those several of you who presented today, you've done kind of the written assignment. Now all I'm going to do for you is verify that you've actually done your notes. And I'm sure I will, because some of you were working directly from notes, which was perfectly appropriate, and all that. But for those of you who did not present, yeah, I'm looking for written assignments and I'm looking for notes as well. Now, again, is it clear what I'm asking? If you present, I still want the notes. If you don't present, I still want the notes. The cutoff for me is essentially Monday morning after the Sunday evening when the assignment is due. If I don't see the notes, I'm going to deduct points from your grade. Okay, now if you go back later on and you fill in notes, that's for you, but you won't get the points. Okay, they're still functional for you. You won't get the points. Will it break the back of your grade? No, but it might move an A to a B or a B to a C. So you're going to notice it if you haven't done the notes. The reason for that is quite simple. I want you to read. And the only way I can be sure that you've read, or reasonably confident that you've read, is to have you summarize what you've read. Now, some of you are thinking, you know what, I don't have to do that because they did summaries in class and I can just make notes from those. You're going to be a C student the rest of your life. If you want to do that, that's fine. If you want to if life is a ride along for you, that's your choice. It really is. Yeah, that's your choice. I'm not going to get involved in that. I don't much care. If you don't really want to learn, I don't really want to teach you. But it's of much more use to you if you get ahead of that and take those readings on your own terms and make sense of that on your own. Now you can be guided by the presentations, but theoretically you would already have done your notes, and now you'd be augmenting those with the presentations. All right, but you do it any way you want. Anything else? Okay, I thought this went really well. I was really happy. I mean, uniformly, I was happy with the presentations. I thought they were all solid. They're all well above average. I got some very enthusiastic notes here. I try to remember to shut my mic off because I'm typing notes as I'm listening to you. And so this should give you an idea going forward. This is how to approach the presentation. Okay. Otherwise, you've got an assignment on Sunday, and then presumably I will see you next Monday afternoon in class. Okay. All right. I'll see you then.
I was hoping to chat with you a little bit after class, if that's okay.
Sure. 1 second.
Um,
Let me stop the recording.